into some of the work by Paul Gilroy in Against Race. However, a closer reading of race in South Africa suggests a much more complex relationship between race and anti-racism, iterations that highlight how each moment may in fact be read as an incremental attempt at the mastery of the historical and collective traumata of coloniality in South Africa. So, without going into a lengthy history of race in South Africa, perhaps just to say that by the end of the 1800s and the 1900s, the beginning of the 1900s, leading up into the 1920s, with the definition of the poor white problem and the Carnegie Commission, of course, we had incremental steps towards disenfranchising the entire population, which of course culminates at some point in 1948 apartheid policy. But I think it's important at this point to say that at the turn of the 20th century, despite these developments in the direction of disenfranchisement and the mobilization of race in very particular ways, there was already a developed and growing awareness of the common economic plight and social position that provided the impetus for people labeled as colored and African to forge significant alliances in non-racial organizations such as the Industrial and Commercial Workers' Union of the early 1900s. The later formation of the ANC in 1912 in part drew on this tradition, but was also strongly influenced by the political thrust of nationalism and multiracialism, which could also be understood as the de facto mode of social relating in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Of course, this also has to be understood within the historical period immediately following the formation of the Union and South Africa's ongoing relationship to Britain. Eminent figures such as Gumede and Plaatje were sent on deputations to England in 1909 and in the early 1920s to make the case for social transformation in South Africa. This was directed towards striving for equality amongst blacks and whites, but of course was underpinned by elements of black nationalism, a current that prevailed and continues to prevail in much of the work of the African National Congress today. Again, the point I'm trying to make is that for every move, there's a counter move. Yeah? The National Party's election victory in 1948, of course, saw grand apartheid, saw petty apartheid. It saw the regulation of social life, not only in the big scheme of things, but also in the quotidian, the everydayness of microaggressions and incivilities that came to characterize much of South African society. By 1960s and the 1970s, of course, you had an organic social crisis and an economic crisis, and of course there were responses to the mobilization and the institutionalization of segregation through apartheid. Collective forms of political resistance that emphasized non-racialism, black consciousness and anti-racism opened the way for once more for different constructions of the race subject that were dissimilar to those constructions at the height of apartheid. By the 1940s, organizations such as the Non-European Unity Movement were formed, and as a central principle, non-collaboration was adopted as a means of resisting all segregationist policies and institutionalized structures that were increasingly coming into being to generate an unworkable system. The boycott strategy was accompanied by principles of non-racialism and placed the idea of opposing racial categorization and classification in the context of resisting a system that was not simply racially ordered hierarchically, but was also done in the service of exploitation. By the 50s, non-racialism was of course co-opted by the Torch Commander and the Liberal Party and the Congress of Democrats. While it was apparent that there were even fissures and forms of heterogeneity within whiteness at the time, of course, this was the basis for the intellectual lineage of people like Lembede and Sobukwe to critique precisely the idea of non-racialism and to allow for Pan-Africanism in the 50s and 60s in the context of African anti-colonial and independence struggles. Still later, Biko, in the tradition of Du Bois, Fanon and others, critiqued this political current in the 70s and espoused black consciousness, when he argued that this approach was liberal insofar as to meet white racism with non-racialism was a weak attack on racism that was based on passivity. Instead, he argued that black consciousness should counter the divisive effects of racism on blacks through encouraging the rejection of racist labels, develop amongst all blacks a sense of dignity and pride in their common blackness, and resulting in the use of the term black to incorporate all of those who were in fact not categorized as white. This anti-racist discursive practice acted as a unifying factor, of course, across racial boundaries. Even later in the 1980s, elements of non-racialism, black solidarity and anti-racism were deployed in the historical period in which the boycott and non-collaboration practices were again invoked in relation to things like the tricameral parliament and so on. I raise this because, of course, it goes even further, that non-racialism, black consciousness, and so on are also appropriated by certain strands within the left, particularly the Leninist Trotskyist tradition, more specifically. Again, I want to make several points about this. The first is that the nature of the race subject changes over time, not only discursively but categorically and in terms of social identities. The second is that within these historical processes, strands of continuity are clearly evident in traditions of accounting for, thinking about and constructing the race subject, but these are continuously evolving in response to resistance politics as well. In other words, the state makes a move, resistance politics makes a counter move, and the state makes another move in response to that. Thirdly, while this illustrates the dangerous adaptive potential, mutability and recrudescence of racialized social relations, it also suggests that social relations are not always what they have been, nor should they always be what they are today. Fourthly, politico-intellectual currents have changed depending on the context and prevailing conditions, where the dominance of multiracialism was confronted with more radicalized and tactical forms of non-racialism, strategic essentialism, forms of pan-Africanism, and black consciousness. This again suggests that traditions of resisting racism and creating resistant black subjects are both continuous and evolving, depending on the conditions of possibility and impossibility that allow for specific politico-intellectual traditions to emerge as hegemonic at a given point in history. And a combative and adversarial politics remains a mainstay of critical race praxis. So I want to be clear about that. I'm not suggesting that this, in fact, came to naught. I'm suggesting that, in fact, such a combative politics is an essential part of critical race praxis today. So in returning to the contemporary status of race, I want to briefly highlight some salient elements of precarious whiteness and its associated forms of shame alongside modes of embodied black rage in South Africa today. People like Rateli and Loubser point out that in some ways whiteness has always been constructed defensively, initially in relation to indigenous blacks, and this was of course consolidated during apartheid even further. However, they also note how this subjectivity was perhaps always under threat from its own illogical classification system, with the very label of whiteness kind of being open to fickle attribution and recategorization. Other writers like Jill Straker have pointed to an unsettled nature of whiteness, and drawing on the work of Eng and Han around racial melancholia, argue for a complicated understanding of mourning and loss pertaining to one's own racial identifications, resulting in alienation and confusion. And she suggests this is unsettled nature of whiteness is important to confront, as it may allow whites to live more productively with their own limitations. Living with a potential powerlessness, despite relative privilege, as well as a sense of betrayal by one's own group of the ideals that one imagined that it embraced, may be partly related to why so many whites now publicly express shame about racism, especially given that it is not in the nature of shame to be expressed publicly. However, she also cautions against what she refers to as promiscuous shame, a gratuitous expression of the shame as having the potential to recenter whiteness in ways that are unproductive. Other writers like Hugo Canham, on the other hand, have also explored the operations of racism and the manifestation of rage in and on the body, the black body in particular. And some of this discussion occurred a little early on. It is, of course, within the body that subjectivity is materialized. Of course, within modernity, codifications of the body have been and remain central to processes of alterity and marginalization. The use of physiognomic features, accent, language, dress code, skin color, sexual dissimilarity have all been markers of othering. Yeah? As such, the body is the quintessential psychosocial zone, the interface between the individual and the social, and is critical to the formation of the self, as well being simultaneously socially inscribed. The import of this analysis for studies of race and violence should of course not be lost on us, as the bodily realm comes to represent a site in which the individual and the social converge, where the social is translated and enacted personally and interpersonally, and the self is mobilized or activated with interactional moments. Here, the body can be seen variously. For example, a canvas, an instrument of power, a communicative tool, a mode of reinstating citizenship, and of course, as a means of reconstituting obliterated psychic space. Fanon, for example, suggested that within coloniality, black subjects are reduced to objects partly through collapsing historical racial schemas about the black other into bodily schemas and ultimately into racial epidermal schemas, a process in which there's the bifurcation of the soma or body and the psyche, and the sum total of the black subject is reduced to skin color. Under these conditions, the psychic worlds of the black subject or black subjects are declared absent, a point that was made earlier on. They are obliterated for all intents and purposes. Within the context of movements such as Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall, deploying the primacy of the black body's pain as a response to the bifurcation of the soma and the psyche may be understood as an organic response to reconstitute and reclaim these sequestered, obliterated parts of the psyche. Rather than thinking about embodied enactments simply as psychologically regressed states of functioning or some primordial state, the body is a site of materialized psychic expression. The body's expression is a disclosure akin to artistic expression. Your act is also you. So it's not surprising to find black rage and white privilege that is attempting to manage its loss colliding in our political life today. In reflecting on the relationship between white melancholia and black rage, Eagle, for example, connects this to the borderlands of white subjectivity in South Africa, in which white privilege, subjectivity, and whiteness are the conceivably legitimate recipients of anti-white sentiment and black rage in a climate of Afrocentricity and a renewed decolonial impulse. While this expression of rage and hatred may in part be a repetition of historical, collective, and personal traumata, and consequently a site in which moments of jouissance, to use a term from Lacan, may be experienced. In other words, a painful pleasure associated with the surfacing of trauma in the perpetrator, bystander, or beneficiary. A trauma related to the shame and complicity at having been the white historical beneficiaries of a racist dividend. This surfacing of trauma in the perpetrator, bystander, or beneficiary itself creates a paralysis, a speechlessness, a moment without the words to respond, as the signifier becomes inadequate to explain the experience. The kinds of impasses that we saw during Fees Must Fall are good illustrations of this, where white and black students, white and black staff often found themselves on opposite sides of